Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the second lecture of the 2023 Royal Army's Summer Lecture Series. I'm Mark Bennett, I'm the Museum's Research Manager, and thank you for joining us today. The Royal Army's is the UK's national collection of arms and armour. It started life as a medieval stockpile of weapons at the Tower of London. By the 1830s, we had a ticket booth and guidebook. By the late 1990s, we occupied not just the Tower, but our purpose-built home at Leeds and the Victorian fort outside Portsmouth. All our sites are open and the summer programme is in full swing, current weather notwithstanding. For more details, go to the museum's website, which is royalarmies.org. If you prefer something home-based, and I couldn't blame you given the current weather, our summer lecture series features contributions from those just starting out on their academic careers. We have a range of talks to match the range of the museum's collection, as well as today's talk on the display of Japanese armour. You can look forward in quick succession to explorations of the after effects of the new industrialized trench warfare seen in the First World War, the martial prowess of the early Roman Republic's Gallic opponents, and the use of fear by the pirates of the 17th century. If you missed last week's talk on firearms in 16th century Italy, you may be pleased to know that it and all our talks from now on will be available to watch again on YouTube. Likewise, if you just outright prefer the YouTube interface, feel free to watch over there instead. We can't link you to the talk because of vagaries in how it's done, but if you go to that channel at the appointed time, we'll be live and you can find us there. There is a delay in the feed, so bear it in mind when it comes to the questions. And speaking of questions, after the main event, we will be doing a Q&A session from both Zoom and the YouTube chat. So send them in as they occur to you, and I will put them to the speaker after the talk. I can't guarantee to get through them all. I can't promise to cover the most popular ones, but we will cover as many as we can. If you happen to be hard of hearing or English perhaps isn't your first language, there is a CC button at the bottom of the screen in both Zoom and YouTube, which will add closed captions. If there are any other technical issues, people in Zoom have the option to raise a hand. I've had reports that the slides last week caused some people some issues, but that zooming out fixed it. If you are really struggling, then YouTube might be the better bet. Google has quite a lot of money to throw at these problems of user interfaces and the like. But with all these boring technical considerations out of the way, let's turn to today's event. There are many fascinating stories about the museum's Japanese collection, which are hardly surprising given that we've been displaying Japanese armour since the 1660s. I should note, however, that we have improved considerably since the early 1870s, when the Japanese academic Kume Kunitake reported that our sword collection was inferior pieces of the kind found in any antique shop. So to tell us more about, not just about our collection, but the display of Japanese armour in general, we're joined by Sahava Baranow. Sahava is a doctoral student at Durham University, working on questions of how Japanese identity was formed. To explain this, she draws on, among other sources, museum collections and international exhibitions, examining the twin images of the samurai and geisha. So without any further ado, over to you, Sahava.
Thank you so much, Mark, for this introduction, and thank you to the Royal Army for inviting me to speak today. It's really an honor, and of course, thank you to everybody who is here today to listen. Right, so I will just share my screen with you. Just a moment. Having a issue slide our preparation. Can everybody see the screen?
Yep, looks good to me.
Okay. Having still a little bit of a problem on my end. 1 second. Sorry. Okay, just one moment. Can't see my own screen once I start sharing. Is a problem. That's where my. Okay, sorry, just one try. I think you can see the screen now, but it shouldn't be in full screen. Is that right?
Yes. So we've just got we've got the whole PowerPoint interface around it.
Okay. My problem is when I open it fully, then I can't see anything anymore. So I think we will just proceed as it is now. I apologize for that. I hope this is not too bothersome. All right. So without any further ado, apologies for this issue. Let's start. So Japanese armor in Western collections and invention of Bushido. So what we see here is a hand-colorized photograph of an album in silver print taken by Kotakabe Kinbei between the 1870s and the 1890s. In collections, this is usually credited as a photograph of samurai in armor, and we will learn more about why this descriptor is perhaps misleading and why specifically images like these could be seen as contributing to an invention of a tradition that perhaps never really existed. Have a look at the contents for today's talk. We'll be talking about the Meiji era. We'll provide a brief overview of why this period was so essential to the invention of an imagined way of the warrior and a national identity based on masculinity. We'll then move on to talk about statehood and the relationship between the nation state and masculinity during this Meiji moment. Next, we will be speaking about Bushido itself, the ideas that come with this concept of the way of the warrior. What is reality and what is fantasy about life of warriors in Tokugawa Japan during the rule of warrior class and also later on. And finally, I would like to provide a brief postscript about the 20th century and the continued legacy of Bushido. And I will offer a few conclusions, and there will be a little bit of suggested further reading for anybody who's interested and more information about the images I'm using today. Speaking of images, the image you see on the left-hand side is a V&A suit of armor. So it's not held by the Royal Armory, but rather the V&A. It was a diplomatic gift from Tokugawa Iemochi, which was the penultimate shogun before the warrior rule in Japan collapsed. To Queen Victoria in 1860. It landed in the V&A in 1865, and it was likely assembled specifically as a diplomatic gift. The person who brought this suit of armor over to Britain was Sir Rutherford Alcock, who had been nominated Britain's first consul general in Japan in 1859, and he wrote back home on 14th of July. Of that year. The day after the ratifications of the Treaty of Edo exchanged, I received intimations from the Tycoon, the shogun, the military ruler of Japan, that His Majesty had caused a list of articles to be prepared as a present to the Queen. So from this text, we can understand how misguided a lot of the communication between Western countries, by which I mean primarily European countries in the United States and Japan at the time, where he refers to people wrongly. He believes that shogun is equivalent to the queen, whereas really he was a military commander rather than the head of state, and all sorts of other miscommunication. So let's talk a little bit more about this Meiji period moment. And please bear in mind that this will be a sort of whirlwind introduction to a period which has a big scholarship and many ideas attached to it. As a quick overview, in 1854, Commodore Perry was an American naval man standing in for millet Fillmore, traveled to Japan with gunships, demanded the country open up trade. However, some historians have argued that other problems had already existed in Japanese society, economic stagnation, and that change was in the air at this moment in time. Whatever may be true, suddenly Japan became forced to contend with the world beyond its borders, and with ways of governance and ways of living outside of its own borders. Let's take a step back and consider how Japan had been ruled up until then. From 1603, the Battle of Sekigahara, until the mid-19th century, Japan had been ruled by, as I mentioned earlier, the military shogunate, with the emperor away in Kyoto as a symbolic figurehead and true government being run from the capital, Bushido, at the time. Today we call it Tokyo. This relationship between the shogunate and the emperor was complex and changing throughout this long period of military rulership. It was based on daimyo, who were high-ranking warriors in charge of individual domains of the realm. It's often believed that this was a fairly centralized government. However, this is not really accurate, as the daimyo had large authority over governance of their own domains and over laws applicable in their domains. However, at the top in charge, we had the Tokugawa shogunate. Right. And during this prolonged time, the policy of sakoku, meaning closed country, ruled the way the Japanese people lived, insofar as nobody could come in and nobody could go out. At least that was the big idea. In reality, there was some exchange. There were especially Dutch traders on what they refer to as Nagasaki. Actually, it was an outpost, Ijima, where they were allowed to trade. They weren't really allowed to come into the country and travel extensively. There was also a group of Portuguese missionaries around Francis Xavier who ended up in Japan, some shipwrecked people, like where some Japanese did go out and there was trade between China and Korea and so on and so forth. So the idea of an entirely closed country has been disproven. However, it was highly restricted. You could interact with the outside world, and the shogunate was worried about harmful influence from outside. This Tokugawa rule was also characterized by 4 distinct social classes. At the top of this social order were the shi class, what we in English often refer to as samurai. Shi, really, bushi is usually what they are called in Japanese. They are the military class. Samurai was actually a term more often used for lowly elements of that class, the people who were not daimyo, the people not the most powerful warriors. And we had farming peasants referred to as no, artisans ko, and lastly sho, merchants, who were seen as the lowest in this group as they did not produce anything themselves. Again, this is the broad idea. There was some social mobility, there were some differences and exchanges between these groups, but just keep this in mind as an overall idea. Finally, returning to Commodore Perry and the American warship outside of Japan, there was an internal grappling that started after the warships arrived, and a civil war ensued. Finally, the shogunate fell and the emperor was, quote-unquote, restored to power, which is why this period is often also referred to as the Meiji Restoration. In popular histories, this process is often described as westernization, but that can be a deceptive view. In reality, this process was marked by contradiction and conflict, which is where we get to this beautiful illustration on this slide, which I hope you can kind of make out. It's a little crop from the bigger image, and I highly recommend that you look at it. It's called The Mirror of the Rise and Fall of Kaika and Injun, by the print artist Shosai Ike, who was active in the early 1870s. So this is from around 1872-73. Here what we see is different concepts fighting one another in this early Meiji period, in this period of trying to see how the rest of the world is living. So on this left side here, there is different hairstyles, in fact. So this is referred to as a zangiri hairstyle, and this is referred to as a yaro hairstyle, which are often called Western or indigenous Japanese hairstyles, but that's not entirely accurate. These are, as we'll hear later, fighting one another for dominance. Here we have different binding styles and writing styles. So here's a pen and a Western binding style, and here's a traditional Japanese binding style, and brushed. You can also see that the figures fighting each other are attired differently. Again, you might call it at first glance Western or indigenous Japanese. But the reality is obviously much more complicated with some of these things, as on the right-hand side, rickshaw pushing out the ox cart. Neither of these is indigenous to Japan or West as such. This was just a period of change rather than pure Westernization. And start it again. Good. Come back. One moment. Yeah. So here these different types of objects and ideas are fighting each other with conflict at the heart of it, rather than a Western idea surpassing Eastern ideas. And next, I would like to talk to you about one individual, one Japanese individual, who was influencing culture and society at this moment in time. Natsume Soseki is, I should say, one of Japan's most celebrated writers ever. He was active during the Meiji period, but he's still celebrated, loved, and widely read in Japan today. And part of his life he spent in Britain as a government scholar, which at that time was very common to engage with other countries outside of Japan to find out how things were done in these powerful countries on the geopolitical stage that managed to force others to bow to their will. So he was in Britain between 1900 and 1902, initially in Cambridge, which proved to be too expensive on his meagre government scholarship and forced him to relocate to London, where he was based at University College London. He was truly unhappy in London. He did not like it. He did not like the people, and he struggled with his mental health quite significantly. However, upon returning to Japan, he began teaching, and a few years later, in 1905, he had his literary break with the novel I Am a Cat, which some of you might be familiar with. That same year, he also published a short story, which is less well known, called Tower of London. Let's read a quote from story. All of the weapons were well polished and gleamed brilliantly. Back in Japan, the weapons in history books and novels had never captured my interest. It was a delight to see them laid out like this before my own eyes. The theme I would really like to highlight at this quote is displayed objects too. So what he's saying here is that, of course, there is armory. There's armor and there are arms in Japan, and he's read about them. Perhaps he has not seen displayed in such a manner, specifically for educational or entertainment purposes, and that this is something that really stuck with him. So he rates this story first person, and you can be pretty sure that he saw the Tower of London based on the story and on the detailed descriptions, for example, of the armor of Henry VIII and names of people he encountered on this visit, like Walter Raleigh, and he's imagining these characters wearing breeches and pondering their lives and the end of their lives, perhaps. So it is quite likely that he actually went there. And I've got a second quote, which is the only time in the story that anything about his Japanese heritage becomes important. Beefeater pointed out an old suit of Japanese armor, asking with his eyes if I had seen it. I nodded in silence. He explained to me that it had come to Charles II as a tribute, by way of Mongolia. I nodded a third time. So here, he did not ask to see this Japanese armor. The context of this interaction is that the guard surmises that he must be Japanese and offers to show him this piece of armor. And yet it is displayed in the context of traditional knighthood. It is displayed alongside the armor of British knights, of a tradition of chivalrous values, perhaps, So this might be something to keep in mind throughout the talk as we go. Now, to answer the question of what Natsume Soseki actually saw while he was in London, it's probably one of the two varnished armours given to Captain John Saris of the East India Company in September 1613, which is still in the collection of the Royal Armoury today. These two suits of armour were probably presented to James the first, although no record survives of the actual delivery. They were most likely the first Japanese armour to arrive in Britain, as it was so early. So as we've had, this is already during the Tokugawa period, when technically there shouldn't really be any exchange going on, then proving the point that there was wiggle room. However, throughout its history in Britain, lots of confusion about its origin and provenance has persisted, as Mark has mentioned earlier in the discussion. There were some issues with display of East Asian armour in all of Europe at this time. Inventoried in 1649 to 51 by the Commonwealth government for the posthumous sale of Charles I's possession, and in this accession it was described as an Indian armour. In 1662, it was then described as a present to Charles II from the Emperor Mughal, so again claimed that it was an Indian piece, and as late as 1916, confused with another in the Royal Armoury, which had in fact been given to Philip II of Spain in 1585. So we see it doesn't, there's a little bit of confusion around what this actually was, and this is reflected in what Beefeater actually tells Natsume Soseki when he's at the Tower of London. However, that's not really why it is interesting in the context of this story. It's unusual because it had come to Europe so early, and the bulk of the weapons actually much later during the time of the Universal International Exhibition. Neatly brings me on to our next subject. These international exhibitions began in London in 1851. At this point, Commodore Perry had not yet arrived at Japan's shore and had not yet been contacted. However, these exhibitions were countries showed themselves, their art and their products to the world to further what they saw as friendly competition and, of course, commerce. Became relevant and stuck. So next time, when an exhibition took place in 1862 in London, the process of opening up had begun in Japan. And one of Meiji Japan's foremost intellectuals, Fukuzawa Yukichi, was present at this exhibition in London in 1862. This would, however, become an unpleasant memory, as Japan was on display from a position of an outsider. So the Japanese government had not officially participated at the exhibition, but the British General Consul in Japan, whom we've heard of earlier with the suit of armour given to Queen Victoria, sent some pieces for consideration. And this was a big failure in the eyes of the press back home in Japan, who saw it as a humiliating selection, as a selection of poor quality and nothing to at home about, really. But then again, when in 1867 the Exposition Universelle took place in Paris, this was a chance to undo the harm of perhaps the earlier exhibition in London. However, yet again, it turned out to be a rather awkward event where, because this was just 1 year before the fall of the shogunate, unified Japan could not be found on display. Instead, 2 delegations were sent to Paris, one official delegation in the name of the Tokugawa shogunate, and the second by the Satsuma domain, one of the rebellious domains that was at this time campaigning for the abolishment of the shogunate and the restoration of the emperor. Now, Parisians could not be sure which Japan was the real one and struggled to distinguish the two and even make sense of the political realities in that country. Finally, in 1873, with the Meiji government participating officially and sweeping changes in the country in full swing, this exhibition turned out to be a big success for the Japanese government. However, primarily in the realm of decorative art, which was problematic in itself, suggesting a lower status than the fine art presented by European countries or the United States. However, at this exhibition too, there was an interesting line drawn between objects and people. So beautiful objects, such as the decorative pieces I just mentioned, were beginning to be connected with noble people. So the image on the right we see here is from a newspaper depicting Japanese workers at the 1873 exhibition in Vienna, as they constructed the Japanese garden and shrine, which was, again, a huge success, quoted in many newspapers at the time. Studio photography became another important part of the exhibitions, as we saw with the very first slide I showed you, particularly Baron Raimund von Stillfried, who was an Austrian minor noble and had set up shop in Japan as a photographer, is central to the story. At the Vienna exhibition, he tried to control the narrative, specifically with the reporting around it, and built himself up as an expert on the subject. He also tried to build a tea house on the premises of the exhibition, which was then struck down as a plan because the exhibition organizers had found that tea houses would be places of vice and prostitution, and that this would have no place in the serious exhibition grounds. In the end, however, von Stillfried simply put his tea house on the outside and the entertainment grounds of the exhibition, which were not really part of the official grounds. And yet, for a visitor to the exhibition, you might ask whether it would really make such a difference, whether this was sanctioned by the general consul of the exhibition. Not, since he would visit it one way or another. Two other names to think about with the studio photography and the distribution of images of beautiful things and noble people. Felice Beato and Kusakabe Kinbei, who took the first photo I showed you earlier of the warriors in armor. Kusakabe Kinbei worked under the guidance and tutelage of both Stillfried and Beato, and then later opened his own Yokohama studio, continuing this tradition of studio photography. And I'm sure some of you can see it coming, but there are conflicting desires at play here. On the one hand, we have these people like von Stillfried, who are trying to make Japan look erotic and exotic and different for an entertainment value, and ultimately to make a profit at adventures such as an exhibition. And then there are people like Tokugawa Yukichi, important Japanese intellectual we encountered earlier, who are trying to show that Japan has an ancient history, an ability of spirit and civilized status to secure geopolitical sovereignty, to not be at the mercy of American or British trade deals which were unfavorable to Japan. Let's take this to the next discussion, statehood, the nation and masculinity. So with these conflicting ideas, we have representations of gender, of course, as well. So different actors are trying to portray a different Japan to the world stage, including the constructed idea of the samurai, or the ideal man, what he should look like. So one of the people who wrote about this extensively was Ozaki Yukio. Yukio was initially a journalist and later became a politician. He's often credited as the father of parliamentary politics in Japan. One thing to note is that he was married to Ye Theodora Ozaki, who was pictured here with him. Her birth name was also Ozaki, her father was Japanese and her British. They were not related though. The reason for mentioning her I will make a little bit clear later on, but I think it's keep in mind that Ozaki was married and that he was married to a woman with mixed heritage. So from the 1870s onwards, Ozaki began to think about militarism and the idea of Bushido. One idea that struck him particularly was the idea of a bun, which can be translated as writing or culture, versus bu, which is the military aspect of culture. So when I said earlier that what we call samurai in English is often referred to as bushi, and that's the bu of bushi, for the military side of things. Ozaki gave a lecture in 1879, arguing that this traditional civil martial binary was no longer holding up, because there was an excessive emphasis on civil virtues during the peacetime of the Tokugawa shogunate. There was no longer any reason to go to war. And as a consequence, this martiality had weakened and no longer played a key role. But he thought that for a successful society to exist, there needed to be a balance between those two ideas. He also said that in England, on the other hand, women were attracted to naval officers and he himself advocated for similar circumstances in Japan. It's worth noting that in these ideas, he highlighted frankness, bold thriftiness, courage, quick-mindedness, generosity, and liveliness. However, he did not mention anything about loyalty or self-sacrifice. And this is interesting because these were key concerns in later Bushido discourse. And this is something that other writers had claimed was always essential to Bushido and the way of the warrior. What is interesting to see is an inclusion of self-improvement and personal advancement. Gentlemanliness really is what he was trying to get at. And this relationship between him and a British woman is probably partly of British heritage, a woman of partly British heritage. It's quite important in this sense because it showed the ideas on gentlemanliness in relationship to female ideals, femininity. It also went hand in hand with Victorian literature of the time, which Ozaki certainly did read. Samuel Smiles' Self-Help was translated in 1871 into Japanese and was one of the most influential and popular books in Meiji Japan. Here, the gentleman was embodiment of moral success and really one whose nature has been fashioned after the highest models. So this is why, for Ozaki, gentlemanliness became a key factor in the definition of Bushido. He argued that the idea of gentlemanliness was absent in Japanese discourse, and as a counterpart, he could come up with this idea of Bushido. There were other authors like John Edgar or Francis Hitchman who had written extensively about the value of being a gentleman, and their influence shows as well. So initially, Ozaki attempted to create this idea, this institution of Bushido, to correspond with gentlemanliness. He sent a letter titled Shinshi to the Choya Shimbun to explain the virtues of true English gentleman to a Japanese readership, because he felt that the Japanese term Shinshi often described something that was not in line with the true meaning of the term gentleman. It described somebody who was living a luxurious life, who was wearing top hats and riding in black carriages, perhaps engaging in card games, gambling, visiting geisha, all these types of things. And he felt that this was wrong and that this was not the true meaning of gentleman conduct. However, his view of Bushido shifted over time. It was most influential before the Sino-Japanese War, and after 1895, it developed into a slightly different. So now, initially, he had said that he was creating this idea to complement gentlemanliness in Britain. However, now he was kind of claiming a connection to older intrinsic Japanese values, saying that he was actually just going back to something that had existed in the Japanese tradition for a much longer time. Next, I would like to introduce to you Nitobe Inazō. This quote I have here. So Nitobe Inazō wrote, "Chivalry is a flower, no less indigenous to the soil of Japan than its emblem, cherry blossom, nor is it a dried up specimen of an antique virtue preserved in the herbarium of our history. It is still a living object of power and beauty among us. And if it assumes no tangible shape or form, it nonetheless scents the moral atmosphere that makes us aware there's still a spell." Right, so this is rather flowery language, verbose, and you might think that this is maybe not the nicest translation. However, Nitobe actually wrote this in English first. So he wrote his treatise on Bushido in 1899, it was published in 1900, and it only appeared in Japanese after that. So in the West, his work is often associated with the birth of Bushido, but because of this translation history and because of its origin, publication in the United States first, it really wasn't. In fact, he arrived to the debate later than when it had already started. He himself wanted to be a bridge across the Pacific. He saw his mission to connect specifically the United States and Japan. He was, like Ozaki, initially a journalist, and he had traveled significantly in America, Germany, and later on he was in Taiwan and ended his career in Switzerland as Undersecretary General of the League of Nations from 1920 to 1927. However, like Fukuzawa Yukichi, he was also hurt by the initial arrogant Western treatment of Japan at exhibition, ridiculing Japan, or seeing it as a general other area in the imagined hierarchy of civilization. As a consequence, he praised the fighting spirit, which Japanese people supposedly had as an innate quality. However, these ideas showed echoes of social Darwinism and Christian thinking. What he was getting at was an ideal between civilized manliness and primitive masculinity. In his work, in his book, Spell and Work, his poem, I should say, Spell and Work, actually, he referenced Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden by coming up with this unpleasant idea of the brown man's burden. What he was referring to here was Japan's need to resuscitate Korea and the Korean people who supposedly lacked masculine traits, were in need of a strong masculine Japan to sort of rescue it. And this really shows that the need to constantly construct and reconstruct Japan's identity, reflection of the attempts to join the tail end of the age of imperialism, as Britain had done in its colonies, France had done in its colonies. Now it was Japan's time to use the same rhetoric of a vision of friendship and lifting up and bringing masculinity to supposedly effeminate peoples. I would also like to mention in this context, Mary Patterson Elkin Nitobe, who was wife of Nitobe Inazō. In the foreword to Bushido, Nitobe wrote, "The direct inception of this little book is due to the frequent queries put by my wife as to the reasons why such and such ideas and customs prevail in Japan." This is interesting because he directly credits Mary with having made possible this book. Mary herself was a seventh-generation American Quaker with ancestors Georgia, I think, that had come to America from England in 1977. He had met Nitobe in 1886 when he had given a lecture to women of the Quaker community about Japan, and they met at a tea afterwards. He traveled to Germany after his meeting to prepare for his appointment at Sapporo Agricultural School. However, he maintained a continuous correspondence with Mary, and there seems to be evidence in these letters that Mary actually wrote some of the texts and articles credited to Inazō during this pen-pal relationship. After some years of discontinued relationship, the two decided to marry to great resistance of both of their families. Eventually still did, and they relocated to Sapporo together. Through Mary and the Quaker community, Inazō read a significant amount on the subject of Christianity and Quakers specifically, and he was actually also compiling a series of articles with William Penn, the founder of the Quaker colony in Pennsylvania. The couple also had relationships with Anna Halston and Rachel Reed, who were Quaker women relocating to Japan, partly for companionship and for support in various social ventures of the couple in Japan. And these women in turn had connections to Meko Tsuda, who was one of the foremost women's rights activists in Meiji period Japan. So Here we have an image of this couple of who are deeply entrenched in ideas of Christianity, of values of masculinity related to that field of thought. And now Nitobe is also writing about Japan, and I think it's quite clear that in the relationship with his wife and the relationship with Christianity are reflected in his own ideas about masculinity in the Japanese context. Just a little note on Fukuzawa Yukichi at this point in time. We have encountered multiple times. Here he is in 1862 when he was on his trip in Europe, appropriately before the Meiji restoration, dressed in his samurai attire, wearing his sword. Here he is after the Meiji restoration. Initially, in his relationship to Bushido, he was lauding the abolishment of the Tokugawa status and of the shogunate. However, as time went by, he too mourned the loss of the samurai spirit, and he spoke about this samurai spirit as a supposed strength of unique and traditional Japan, which had now somehow been lost. The last intellectual I'd like to introduce the series is Inoue Tetsuchiro. He was the first professor of philosophy at the Imperial University. He was also interested in literature and wrote extensively on the subject. However, he opposed Christianity and tried to reframe Bushido as an innate Japanese value system. And writing on the subject in 1905, he is best known for an ultra-nationalist interpretation on this subject. So he wrote, Bushido did not originate from an individual advocator, but it is a product of the Japanese nation. Here, it was constructed in his eyes as an essential and unchangeably Japanese idea, despite outside influences. So even if there were Western ideas or older Chinese Neo-Confucian ideas built into it, he claimed that Bushido still retained a certain purity and that these external values were only branches, not the tree itself. Let us continue on to the subject of competing masculinities in the realm of fashion and looks and the body itself. So the image you see here is the Howl of the People's Rights Party. So this is from armour, which was a satirical magazine, and this was published in 1880. So you can see on the right there these people in what looks like Western dress, their top hats, their trousers, shoes, all the rest of it, and they're restraining a dog. The dog here, it says Min, and this is the sign for dog, which is Ken. Min Ken, it's a pun. Ken also means right, and Min Ken means the right of the people. So these people who are dressed in this European-looking attire of restraining the rights of the people. Here at the back, we have these people dressed in traditional Japanese clothing who are in the background upset by this. So we can see that the styles of dress were truly important to what kind of a masculinity was generally en vogue at the time, or what kind of masculinity would correspond to different political stances. So, as I said, this was contested based on dress, accessories, and hairstyle. And there's a creation of a binary between rulers and the people. The gentleman is seen in a frock coat, necktie, and white-collared dress shirts. And this was seen as necessary to prove that Japan was not backwards on a world stage, as we have seen with the example of Fukuzawa and others in this series. If you notice, most of their were in Western-style dress. However, this was also based on the idea of Victorian decorum. In opposition, there was a demand for a parliamentary system that had been collectively termed the Freedom of People's Rights Movement, which had criticized this feminine. And at the head of this critical side were people who referred to themselves as soshi, who were often young men of samurai background, perhaps lower-ranking samurai, drawn in with the idea of nationalism, drawing on what they perceive to be the government's failure of military action, specifically in Korea. These people were easily identifiable by what they were wearing. So there was characteristic thick, long stitching on the crest of their kimono, and they often ripped their kimono by hand to see rougher, carrying clubs, and generally with an air of aggression around them. So here we have an image by a French artist showing them sort of causing trouble. They're carrying their clubs and police in the background. There was also the idea of high kara and bankara. So high kara, high collar, and bankara with low collar, as this opposition between high-ranking gentlemen and the reactionary soshi. The medium of this conflict would have been carried out by comic magazines, caricature, as we have seen from the last two. So there was a trend in the Meiji period based on Japan Punch, which was initially a comic magazine catered to foreigners. And as a consequence out of that group, margin, again, inspired by publications in Britain, such as Punch and the Illustrated London News. These magazines had a fairly high readership, and this activity really peaked in the 1880s. The Soshi subculture ultimately declined, and it wasn't really replaced with anything else. But this idea of masculinity did sort of carry on into far right and ultranationalist direction, especially in the 1920s and 30s. And the last little comment on the idea of masculinity as a visual manifestation. So tonsorial regulation, the regulation of hairstyles, was also a site of masculine identity building. However, it was messy and complex and changed over time, really go backwards and forwards rather than progressive linearly to define a new nation in struggle rather than in a pure Western superstition of anything that was indigenously Japanese before. So there were a number of hairstyles which were commonly worn by different people in Tokugawa period Japan, and one of them was the Zangiri hairstyle, which is the closest to this one here. During Tokugawa era Japan, this was primarily worn by hinin, social outcasts. However, with the switch over to Meiji Japan, this was suddenly characterized as a Western hairstyle and preferred by gentlemen, those in government, as opposed to the hanpatsu, which is the traditional top knot, which you can see here. However, hanpatsu styles were also not merely used to identify high status. Instead, there were complex traditions surrounding growing and hair, which would indicate status and identity, but also significant life events. So loss and grieving, people would cut their hair, or when they entered adulthood, they would change their hairstyles. So really, in hindsight, this has often been described as a change from Japanese hairstyles to Western hairstyles, but this is not entirely accurate. In reality, this was just a complex conflict between different ideas of what was appropriate at different times. And just have a little step back into the reality and fantasy of Bushido periods of actual samurai rule. So the image
I'm sorry to butt in because this is absolutely fascinating, but we've come to about 10 minutes to, so right. You may have to give us the edited highlights of the sort of
absolutely. Okay, thank you. Apologies. Right. So just to have a little reality check of what was really happening. I'm just highlighting here that we have a caricature again of a samurai lord with going to the bathroom with retainers outside, sort of holding their noses well. And what I'm trying to say with this is that even though samurai might have been at the top, warriors might have been at the top of social hierarchy, there was still ridicule, and there was still an opportunity to make light of the situation. Just to say that it was rather noble birth rather than innocent behavior that would identify warriors, as we can see here. And this sort of quality was actually quite common to say that bushi were also, and also was a number of 5 to 10% of the general population were part of the warrior class. Another point to keep in mind for the reality check was that a lot of the sorts, the Meiji period, which claimed to be about Bushido, were actually edicts, instruct texts, house codes, guidelines. But what people were instructed to do, and the action, not all the same. As I've kind of alluded earlier, there was rule breaking, and social mobility was definitely possible to some extent as well. And just as a little hint for anybody who wants to know more about the ridicule and the different ways in which samurai culture was kind of made light of. So here are 3 works, which so you can tell on farting would be about and why it would be funny. And then the other 2 were really stored bumbling, bushi, and gambling adventures, things like that. Onto the postscript, really, and the last bit where I just wanted to talk about the representation of the 18th century and beyond. Militarism and its resurfing and historic texts. So as we've heard, as time changed and as we increased the Sino-Japanese, specifically the notion of Japanese as samurai gains traction. And older texts like the Hagakure, the Shadow, 18th century book, which have not been particularly read a lot at any point in time, resurfaced with ideas that the way of the samurai is death, which had always been controversial even at the time of the publication, but suddenly became the source of the nation. And lastly, martial arts, self-sacrifice, and the adoration of education. Just one note on American anthropology in the post-war years. Ruth Benedict was a influential American anthropologist who wrote a book entitled The Chrysanthemum Patterns of Japanese Culture, where she did away with the idea of as any admitting that it meant. However, there were other generalized ideas of the Japanese spirit, a particular thing. And I'm sure some of you will be familiar with these images, just echoes of ideas of bravery, self-sacrifice, loyalty, and popular culture, in high culture even. On the right, we series kind of prize, and in this photo series, or body of the samurai, with reappearing ideas of masculinity. The Last Samurai in Tom Cruise, and we will just offer a few brief conclusions. The international relations really fostered Japanese masculinity, other yet admirable, between exotic entertainment and civilized tradition. Secondly, early Bushido and search for a national ethic, strongly inspired Western texts and concepts, as seen in Ozaki's interest in English chivalry or Nitobe's search for an equivalent to Christian ethics. Importantly, these men's personal relationships influenced their thinking to a great extent too. And lastly, post-war culture and its due context allowed generalized notions of certain values as intrinsic to Japanese until today. And that's everything. Apologies for running my time, and thank you so much.
No, not at all. I'm sorry to have to cut you off because it's such an incredibly rich body of work. I think you said you've not published on it so far, but presumably they can't be too far away.
Thank you. Some other things are in the works at the moment, but it's crossed on that.
So there's your Twitter handle, however, there. So I presume if anyone wants to find out. I mean, so we've got a little bit of time for questions if anyone in the audience happens to have any. But I mean, the thing that I was curious about is we talked about international exhibits and the use of the image of the samurai, the geisha, something evidently they're promoting. Is it also used domestically, or are they too kind of busy with the modernization agenda there to look back? You know, the Japanese government concertedly to look back at kind of using Japanese history in that way?
This is a really great question, and it's absolutely happening in Japan as well. The one interesting facet of the 1870 Vienna exposition is that this exhibition was used in Japan to create the first national museum. So they collected two of everything, one for Vienna and one for the new National Museum. And so these ideas of display, which I tried to highlight in Natsume Soseki's visit to the Tower of London, are absolutely taking hold in Japan. And that also debates on how museum going, which echo debates that had happened earlier in Europe and the United States as well, educate a new populace to embody the values of the state better.
Yeah, and the description of Vienna and the Japanese shrine and the garden, it reminds me a lot of the anthropological villages you sometimes get. So where they will, they'll import colonial subjects from Africa and they'll put on something that's popular. At any stage, either the Japanese government or individuals in Japan say, hang on, this exoticism, this putting us on show, this is actually counterproductive?
This is an absolutely amazing point, which has a really disturbing and fascinating history, namely that initially there were Japanese villages. There was one in Knightsbridge in the 1880s, and they popped up around other places, run primarily by individuals with ties to Japan. So there was a Dutchman married to a Japanese woman putting on this Japanese village as an entertainment venue primarily, and to profit from it, a bit like a fun fair. However, the Japanese government delegation pretty quickly realized that this is, as you say, counterproductive, especially if they want to negotiate equal treaties with Western states. This is probably not great. And so what they do in turn is that they create their own villages and they display the peoples that they themselves colonize. So the people of the Ryukyu Kingdom, which is Okinawa today, put on display, their Ainu people put on display. And even this story is quite complicated though, because some of these people who are put in these villages or in these, as they are sometimes also called, human zoos, actually wanted to be there because they saw it as an opportunity to participate in nationhood and to stake their claim and build their role as to how to become citizens rather than purely subjects in this new Japanese nationhood.
And how popular are these kind of exhibitions? Do we have any information on, are they the top sellers? Are they fairly popular?
They were incredibly popular. So they dominate everything during their run in the newspapers of the time. And everybody seems to have gone and everybody seems to have put little souvenirs and kind of referenced it back. And also they are the beginning of a new kind of economy in these places. Publishing becomes much more important than it used to be. And also somebody else I'm working on is Liz Scharlick, who's a journalist, an Austrian journalist in the 1920s, traveling to Japan and documenting her experiences. Her father actually got his start in publishing through advertisement, the International Exhibition Catalogue, which was a big catalogue of his newspaper, which was a big publication running the whole stretch of the exhibition. So it really changes the makeup of the society where these exhibitions take place. And this is also the case for Paris and London to a smaller extent. There are numbers on it, which I cannot recall off the top of my head, but they were hugely popular for sure. Lots of people did go and see.
And Bushido, so rather than as a kind of a novelty, does Bushido take off in the West either as a kind of genuine interest, scholarly topic, something more popular, even something to emulate, or is it more kind of a curiosity?
This is a good question, and I think there's elements of both of it. So a serious consideration of Bushido as a philosophy and as an ethic to live by, and there are some specifically American philosophers who had picked up on it and kind of referenced it back, and there's certainly a scholarship on the 1960s and 70s, the kind of Buddhist thought that then entered Western countries, various Japanese popular culture picked up on this tradition. And part of the point that I was trying to make about the post-war moment was that although American occupation tried to do away with Bushido, it never really killed it off. It just didn't say much on the subject. So it kind of continued through, and threads of this conversation continued through as a popular skill. And then there was this other kind of philosophical side as well, which did happen around that same time. And also one thing to notice about these people who wrote treatises and editorials on Bushido in Japan is that they had relationships with equivalents outside of Japan. So United States. There was definitely a kind of exchange moment going on rather than just one side.
Mm-hmm. Yes, a question on the military, because I was interested by I forget exactly who it was, but the comment that it stems from the Japanese nation as a whole, Bushido. Were they looking back and finding those behaviors not just in the samurai, but the ashigaro, your standard foot infantry type, coming from less noble origins ultimately? Or was it something that they detected in the upper classes, and like gentlemanliness in the UK, it permeated down by the sort of later part of the period?
This is again a really interesting point in earlier texts and edicts, specifically house rules on what people should behave like. And those were usually just aimed at the top, so there wasn't really much writing about the lower classes, about the lower warrior classes. However, there were some edicts on commoners and how they should interact with warrior culture. Those were constantly contradicting one another and changing over time. And there were sumptuary regulations, which are quite well known, I think, outside of Japan as well, that commoners could not wear the top knot, or commoners could not carry swords and things like that. But as the Tokugawa period carried on, and as well specifically in the merchant class went up, there are signs that even these sumptuary regulations were kind of broken in private. So there are these amazing stories of garments which were red on the inside, and red was forbidden because that was the warrior color, or garments that are red as underwear worn by merchants because they wanted them and it was kind of a status symbol. So this kind of goes back again to breaking with prescriptive texts and kind of figuring out what people were actually doing versus what was asked of them.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's interesting because again, it's similar processes happening in different. So how far Japan is deliberately looking at European examples and trying to do the same things as they are, or if it's just the product of kind of the nature of society at the time. But it's absolutely fascinating. I mean that covered all my major questions. I'm conscious that we're sort of slightly beyond our timescale, but yes, I should also say, just for the benefit of the public, yes, occasionally people did say nice things about the collection and what we had and how it was displayed. It wasn't always so. It's just that the rude ones are slightly funnier, so that's why we tend to use them. But yeah, if anyone would like to go see the armour, it is now properly identified. I have one last question, which kind of sums up effectively the most of the talk, so I'll put it to you. But from Warjoy on YouTube, would you say Bushido is equivalent to chivalry, or are the differences between the two too great to conflate them?
Well, thank you for that question. I think, in essence, the question is, who are you asking? I think this terminology of Bushido was really used by different people to further different ideas. So early on in this Meiji moment, or earlier on in the Meiji moment, it was used to foster this idea of chivalry. I think later on it was used by people like Bushido, further ideas of militarism and martial prowess and things like that. And later on, yet again, by people like Yuka Mishima, it was furthered to talk about a certain type of body as the right body for masculinity. So I think there isn't really one answer, but I'm sure that for certain people, Bushido and chivalry, especially Ozaki, that would have been his answer. So yes.
Yes, I was going to say, if anyone wants to follow up the conversation and happen to be on social media, do you want to plug your Twitter or anything along those lines?
Yeah. I will just come back to sharing this. So my Twitter handle is @Sahava_Baranov, and that's my Durham email address. If you have any questions which we didn't have time to address, do feel free to get in touch. Thanks again for listening, for having me.
No, thank you, Sahava. Absolutely fascinating talk. Just incredibly rich, an area of the collection which we would like to do more on. It's finding the right people to discuss it, but this is brilliant, so thank you for that. Thank you to Emily behind the scenes for taking care of the feed to YouTube and keeping an eye on the chat there. And thanks to you, the audience, for taking the time to join us today. We've gone a little bit over our time, so if you need to head off, please do feel free. However, if you are interested, our talk next week is from Louise Bell, who is a doctoral student at the University of Leeds. She will be looking at how the UK post-First World War dealt with the large number of men, 41,000, as I believe, who returned from war requiring some form of prosthetic limb. So if you're curious as to how they managed that, join them on the 9th of August, next Wednesday, at the same time as today, 2 p.m. Otherwise, I will leave you there. Thank you very much thank you again for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you next week.